Humanity had been banned from the Galactic Council for exactly 12 standard cycles when the first alarm sounded across the outer monitoring arrays, and the memory of that ban still burned through every human ship, station, and colony like an open wound, because the decision had not come from war or crime, but from quiet dismissal, from laughter disguised as procedure, from a council chamber filled with ancient species who looked at the human delegates and decided they were inconvenient, unpredictable, and unworthy of a seat among those who claimed to rule the stars. And when the final vote had been cast and the human ambassador Daniel Harper had been escorted out under polite armed guard, the official record stated that humanity lacked the cultural maturity and strategic restraint required for continued membership, a judgment that echoed through human media and history as a thin excuse for fear, because humanity had grown too fast, adapted too quickly, and refused to accept inherited hierarchies. And so the Council chose exclusion, believing distance would weaken Earth and its colonies, believing isolation would humble a species they still called young. But on Earth and beyond, the reaction was not panic or collapse. It was silence followed by work, because humanity had learned long ago that respect in a hostile universe was not granted by permission, but earned by survival. And while the Council congratulated itself and returned to trade disputes and border skirmishes, human leaders quietly shifted priorities. Budgets were rewritten, research directives changed, and fleets that had once been built for defense were redesigned for endurance, autonomy, and scale, not in preparation for revenge, but for inevitability, because a ban meant one thing with perfect clarity. When the next crisis came, humanity would stand alone, and that understanding shaped every decision that followed, from the expansion of deep space shipyards near Saturn to the construction of autonomous supply chains that could function without council infrastructure. And on Mars, Admiral Laura Bennett addressed a room of officers and engineers and told them in plain terms that no one was coming to help, that humanity would never again assume goodwill as a strategic factor, and that from this moment forward, every human system must be able to survive hostile contact from any known power. A statement that spread quietly but firmly across human command networks, while beyond human space, the Council watched with detached interest as human trade diminished, and their ships withdrew from shared lanes, mistaking restraint for weakness and focus for retreat. And among the Council species, there were those who argued the ban had gone too far, but they were ignored because the dominant power saw advantage in keeping humans out, especially the Kethri Dominion, whose expansionist fleets had long tested Council boundaries, and now saw human exclusion as opportunity. Because Earth sat on routes and resources that the Dominion coveted, and without Council protection, the humans were exposed, or so the Kethri believed. And so the first probes came, small incursions disguised as navigation errors, then merchant harassment, then open demands for tribute framed as security arrangements, all of which were met by human refusals delivered calmly and without threat, which only deepened the Dominion's confidence that humanity had no appetite for real conflict. And when a Kethri patrol sees a mining platform near the Kuiper Belt and detain its crew, the Council issued a statement of non-involvement, citing humanity's non-member status, a line that spread across human networks with bitter clarity. And yet the response was not a public outcry or a rushed military strike, but something colder and more deliberate, because the platform crew was recovered within 48 hours by a human task group that crossed 3 restricted zones without being detected, disabled the Kethri ships without killing their crews, and returned the platform intact, an operation that left the Dominion confused and embarrassed, but still dismissive, attributing the loss to local command failure rather than human capability. And so the pressure increased, and with it the quiet evolution of human doctrine. Because every encounter was logged, analyzed, and folded into a growing understanding of alien tactics, psychology, and command structure. And while the Council debated tariffs and ceremonial disputes, human analysts mapped the galaxy not as a political space, but as a system of pressures and responses, identifying where power was brittle and where alliances were hollow. And this work remained invisible until the day the Council itself faced crisis, when a coalition of Outer Rim species rebelled against Council authority, overwhelming local defenses and threatening core trade routes, a situation that demanded unity and strength, but the Council. Fleets were scattered and slow, bound by procedures and rivalries that made rapid coordination impossible. And in that moment of rising panic, a proposal was raised and quickly dismissed to request limited human assistance, because pride outweighed pragmatism and the memory of the ban was too recent to ignore. But events moved faster than politics. because the rebel fleets pushed inward with unexpected speed, using tactics that mirrored some of humanity's own early doctrines and counsel. World began to fall one by one, not to extermination but to occupation, a calculated demonstration of power, and still humanity watched from the edges, not intervening, not offering aid, not even commenting, because the lesson of the band had been learned too well. And then the rebels made a mistake that shifted everything. They attacked a human convoy near a neutral system, assuming it was lightly defended and politically relevant, and what they encountered instead was a layered response that unfolded over hours, not seconds, as human ships appeared, vanished, reappeared, and cut through the rebel formation with precision that suggested long preparation rather than improvisation. And when the battle ended, the rebels had lost every capital ship, and the convoy continued on course without loss, an event that could not be hidden, because too many sensors had seen it. Too many observers had recorded the data, and within days the council chamber filled with arguments, fear, and growing realization that the species they had expelled had not stagnated in isolation, but had grown stronger without oversight, without compromise, and without restraint imposed by others. And when a formal request for dialogue was finally sent to Earth, it was not a demand or command, but a carefully worded invitation. And on Earth the message was received in silence, reviewed by civilian and military leaders who understood the weight of the moment, because this was not just about returning to the council, but about redefining the balance of power in the galaxy. And when Daniel Harper, older now and carrying the memory of his expulsion, stood again before the council chamber doors, this time escorted not by guards, but by representatives of multiple species who wanted human protection, the galaxy began to understand that the band had not removed humanity from the stage. It had given them the space to prepare, and what they were returning as was not a petitioner seeking acceptance, but a power that no longer needed permission to act. The council chamber had not changed in structure, but it felt smaller when Daniel Harper entered again, not because the room had shrunk, but because the balance of power inside it had shifted, and every delegate present felt that shift, even if they refused to acknowledge it, because humanity no longer stood at the edge seeking recognition, but at the center of the crisis the council could not solve. And the invitation that had brought Harper back was framed as a request for dialogue, yet carried the unspoken admission that the council needed something it no longer controlled. And Harper understood this as he walked past the same tiers of seats where once voices had spoken about humanity as a risk to stability, because now those voices were cautious, restrained, and weighed down by the reality of worlds fallen beyond their reach. And when Harper finally spoke, his words were simple and measured, stating that humanity had received the request, reviewed the situation, and was willing to listen, not because of obligation, but because the instability spreading through the outer regions would eventually reach human space as well, a statement that framed human interest as practical rather than emotional and set the tone for everything that followed, because the council had expected anger or demand for apology, but instead faced calm assessment. And as the situation was laid out in reports and projections, Harper listened without interruption, absorbing details about rebel fleets, fractured alliances, and council response failures. And what became clear was that the council's strength existed on paper, but not in execution, bound by layered approvals and competing doctrines that slowed every decision, while the rebels exploited speed and unity. And when Harper finally responded, he did not offer immediate military aid, but asked direct questions about command authority, engagement rules, and political constraints, questions that revealed gaps the council preferred not to confront, because they exposed how little real control the council had over its own forces. And this discomfort grew when Harper stated plainly that humanity could not operate under council command structures, because those structures had already proven inadequate, and that any cooperation would require operational independence, a condition that sparked immediate resistance from senior delegates who saw it as a challenge to sovereignty. But before those objections could escalate, reports arrived that another council system had fallen, this one closer to the core than any before it. And the chamber fell into uneasy silence, because the crisis was accelerating faster than debate could keep pace. And in that silence, Harper continued, explaining that humanity had spent the years of isolation preparing for scenarios exactly like this, not out of hostility toward the council, but because exclusion had forced self-reliance, and that preparation had produced fleets designed to operate without external support, command structures that prioritize adaptability, and doctrines that assumed worst-case opposition. And as he spoke, images were transmitted to the chamber showing human task groups maneuvering through deep space, not in formation, but as distributed networks capable of converging and dispersing at will. And these visuals unsettled the delegates because they did not match traditional displays of power, lacking the ceremonial scale the council favored, yet conveying something more dangerous, efficiency without spectacle. And when asked why humanity had not intervened sooner, Harper answered that humanity had respected the council's decision to ban them and had not interfered in council affairs, a response that carried quiet irony and left no room for argument. And as debate resumed, it became clear that some delegates now saw humanity as the only viable counter to the rebels, while others feared that inviting human intervention would permanently alter the balance of power, a fear that was not unfounded, because beyond the chamber human fleets were already repositioning, not toward council space, but toward key junctions the rebels would need control to advance, a move made without announcement or approval, because humanity had learned that waiting for consensus often meant waiting too long. And when the rebels encountered resistance at these junctions, they found not static defenses, but dynamic opposition that adapted in real time, forcing them to commit more resources than planned and slowing their momentum. And this shift was noticed quickly by analysts across the galaxy, because it marked the first time the rebels had been checked by an external force, and rumors spread that humanity had returned not as a council member, but as an independent actor shaping the conflict from the shadows. And within the council, this realization intensified internal divisions, because accepting human terms meant acknowledging that the ban had been a strategic error with consequences now beyond reversal, and yet rejecting those terms risked further losses and potential collapse of council authority. And as these debates dragged on, Harper made one final statement before leaving the chamber for further consultations, saying that humanity would act to protect its interests and the stability of nearby regions regardless of council decisions, and that cooperation was still possible if the council was willing to adapt, a message that was neither threat nor reassurance but a statement of fact. And as he departed, the delegates were left with an uncomfortable understanding that humanity no longer needed the council's approval to shape the future of the galaxy, and that the choice before them was no longer whether to allow humanity back, but whether to recognize a power that had already returned on its own terms. As Harper returned to Earth and convened with the Joint Human Command, the scale of what was about to unfold became painfully clear, because the rebellion that had engulfed council space was not a fleeting conflict, but a systemic collapse of authority that would define the next cycle of galactic power, and the council's inability to respond efficiently had left entire sectors vulnerable. A vulnerability that human analysts had anticipated during their years of isolation and preparation, and now every decision had to balance rapid intervention with strategic restraint, because moving too aggressively could provoke widespread war, while moving too slowly risked the rebels consolidating control and cutting off key trade and resource lines essential to human expansion. And so Harper, along with Admiral Laura Bennett, General Marcus Hayes, and Chief Scientist Elena Ortiz, formed a central planning council that operated outside traditional political channels. And they began by identifying critical systems whose loss would cause cascading effects, not merely in the rebellion zone, but across the galaxy, because control over supply routes, communications arrays, and orbital defenses determined more than just military advantage. It dictated the economic and political stability of every aligned system. And while human engineers, tacticians, and cybernetics teams worked to deploy autonomous sensor and defense networks, the rebel fleets advanced, confident that council weakness guaranteed success, and they underestimated the humans again, believing isolation had led to stagnation and technological lag. Unaware that every human fleet now incorporated lessons from prior skirmishes, simulations of alien tactics, and innovations in adaptive propulsion, energy shielding, and real-time coordination that allowed dispersed forces to function as a cohesive unit across light minutes of space. And as the first engagements began, the rebels were met not with overwhelming frontal assaults, but with calculated harassment, feints, and ambushes that destroyed supply lines and disrupted command structures, forcing commanders to make rushed decisions under stress. And reports of these unexpected setbacks reached the council chambers, where panic replaced debate as it became evident that the humans were turning the tide without formally aligning themselves, and the council's diplomats scrambled to issue clarifications, warnings, and ultimatums. But these were ignored by human forces who operated according to their own priorities. And as battles multiplied, entire fleets that had once been confident now faced attrition rates they could not sustain, and yet human casualties were minimal because their doctrines emphasized preservation of personnel and ship integrity while systematically dismantling enemy coordination. And as the rebels attempted to regroup, human scouts had already mapped escape routes, supply caches, and hidden bases, allowing precise strikes that further destabilized their structure, and news of each successive defeat spread through Council and rebel communications, generating disbelief and fear among both allies and adversaries because the species they had dismissed as inexperienced and weak had demonstrated adaptability, foresight, and ruthlessness when required. And when Harper convened with his leadership council to plan the next phase, they decided not to pursue complete annihilation but strategic disruption, ensuring that rebel forces could not reconstitute while preserving the infrastructure and population of the systems they liberated, a principle rooted in humanity's long view of conflict and governance. And as these plans were implemented, aliens across multiple sectors began documenting and analyzing human operations, noting their modular fleet structures, decentralized command protocols, and the ability to anticipate multiple moves ahead in a conflict, a combination that rendered traditional tactics obsolete. And while the Council debated formal recognition, human forces continued to reshape the operational landscape, reclaiming key junctions, securing resources, and demonstrating a level of precision and restraint that astonished observers, because humans measured power not by destruction alone, but by the ability to enforce order and secure compliance without unnecessary loss. And when the rebels attempted to negotiate ceasefires, their representatives were met by humans who listened, questioned, and evaluated without immediate concession, signaling that humanity's return was not about emotion or revenge, but about strategic control. And as weeks turned into cycles, the rebel coalition fractured under pressure, unable to maintain cohesion against a force that could move unpredictably, strike decisively, and retreat without exposure. And finally, the first formal council communication requesting human intervention arrived, not as a request, but as an acknowledgement of the necessity of human authority, and in response Harper outlined terms that ensured humanity's independence, security of human-controlled space, and a permanent voice in council affairs, a framework that the council accepted reluctantly, realizing that the ban that had seemed like a safeguard now stood revealed as a decision that had allowed humanity to return stronger, wiser, and entirely ungoverned. And in the months that followed, human fleets continued to stabilize the galaxy, not by imposing rule, but by demonstrating that competent, adaptable, and decisive action could achieve outcomes that decades of council bureaucracy had failed to secure. And the message across the stars was clear: humanity had returned not as petitioners seeking approval, but as the ultimate power shaping the future of interstellar politics, trade, and security. As humanity's influence expanded through previously council-controlled sectors, the subtle yet relentless reshaping of galactic dynamics became impossible to ignore, because Harper and his leadership team understood that simply winning battles was insufficient. True power lay in controlling perception, alliances, and the flow of information, and so humans deployed a network of intelligence operatives, both AI-driven and field agents, who monitored political movements, economic trends, and military buildups across dozens of systems, creating a real-time understanding of both Council and Rebel activities. And while the Council continued its internal debates, debating protocol and etiquette, human fleets quietly positioned themselves to protect critical nodes, ensuring that no single faction could gain unopposed advantage. And this was achieved through a combination of distributed strike units, automated repair and resupply drones, and fleets capable of independent operation under modular command, allowing human forces to respond to multiple incidents simultaneously without requiring central authorization, a level of autonomy that alien commanders found baffling because it defied their expectation of rigid hierarchical control. And as the rebels attempted sporadic attacks to regain momentum, they encountered tactical traps that forced them to overcommit or withdraw under heavy pressure, a pattern that repeated across multiple sectors and demonstrated a deep understanding of enemy psychology, strategic foresight, and battlefield adaptability. And while the humans achieved these victories without indiscriminate destruction, their reputation grew, with communications intercepted by alien media reporting precise strikes, rapid adaptation to unexpected threats, and a capacity to recover and redeploy faster than any known species. And the psychological impact was profound, because the Council and Rebel commanders alike realized that underestimation of humanity had been the greatest error of their history. And this realization fueled internal conflict among the council delegates, as some advocated immediate integration of humans into joint command operations, while others feared the erosion of traditional authority. A debate complicated by the undeniable fact that human action was already shaping outcomes regardless of council policy. And while these discussions raged, Harper convened meetings with human political, military, and scientific leaders to outline the next phase: expansion, protective influence, consolidation of reclaimed systems, and selective demonstration of force to deter further rebellion, and all operations emphasize preservation of human and civilian assets while degrading enemy coordination, a principle that distinguished human strategy from both council and rebel methods. And in parallel, human engineers worked to deploy advanced communication arrays, energy relays, and defensive platforms across liberated regions, creating infrastructure that reinforced human control while remaining modular and adaptable to local needs. And as this infrastructure matured, trade resumed under human supervision, stabilizing economies, reducing panic, and demonstrating that the human approach combined discipline, foresight, and efficiency, qualities that alien observers documented with increasing fascination and unease, because these capabilities suggested a species capable of independent governance at a scale previously thought impossible. And when the Council formally requested human participation in negotiations with surviving rebel leaders, Harper agreed on the condition that human authority and operational independence be recognized, a framework that guaranteed stability while leaving no room for external micromanagement. And as the negotiations progressed, humanity demonstrated patience, strategic leverage, and willingness to enforce terms through calibrated displays of strength rather than indiscriminate force, earning grudging respect and acknowledgement that their return to galactic affairs was not temporary or symbolic, but fundamental. And as weeks turned into cycles, the human-led stabilization of multiple systems forced the remaining rebel factions to either submit or face systematic dismantling. And while the Council slowly adapted its policies to recognize human authority, alien media and internal communications were filled with accounts of a species that had been dismissed, excluded, and underestimated, yet returned to demonstrate operational mastery, strategic foresight, and ethical restraint. And by the time the Council formally reinstated humanity as a voting member, the reality was that the humans no longer required approval or guidance, because the infrastructure, fleets, intelligence networks, and governance systems they had built during isolation had positioned them as a decisive force capable of shaping the future of the galaxy. And everywhere, from outer rim colonies to core trade hubs, the message was undeniable. Humanity had been banned, humans had returned, and they were now the ultimate power, not because of arrogance or revenge, but because they had prepared, adapted, and executed with precision over years of deliberate strategy. And in that realization, both allies and former adversaries acknowledged that the galaxy had entered a new era, one defined not by council decree, but by human initiative, competence, and control. As human authority solidified across the newly stabilized sectors, the full scope of humanity's transformation from dismissed species to dominant power became increasingly evident, because the fleets that once patrolled solely for defense now acted with calculated autonomy, projecting influence through strategic presence, precision interventions, and rapid adaptability. And the Council, which had assumed humanity's exclusion, would limit their capabilities, watching growing unease as human. Operations demonstrated operational and logistical independence far beyond expectations, and Harper, along with Admiral Laura Bennett, General Marcus Hayes, Chief Scientist Elena Ortiz, and other senior human leaders, coordinated not only fleet movements, but also the integration of civil administration, supply networks, and communication infrastructures in liberated systems, ensuring that each region was stable, self-sustaining, and aligned with human strategic interests and the efficiency of. These operations created a stark contrast to the Council's own bureaucratic mechanisms, which relied heavily on approvals, layered hierarchies, and rigid protocols that slowed response times. And as the rebels continued to fracture under consistent, adaptive pressure from human forces, isolated factions attempted to negotiate independently, only to encounter carefully calibrated deterrence, forcing compliance without widespread destruction. And these actions amplified humanity's reputation as a force both precise and formidable, because their approach combined foresight, discipline, and a willingness to act decisively without emotional overreach. and across multiple sectors, intelligence networks reveal that alien civilizations previously allied with the Council were beginning to reassess their positions, quietly seeking cooperation with human authorities rather than relying solely on Council guarantees, a shift that reflected both fear and respect. And as Harper oversaw expansion into strategic junctions, communication hubs, and resource-rich systems, humans applied methods of influence that extended beyond pure military power, including trade incentives, technological sharing, and defensive guarantees, all structured to reinforce human authority without invoking overt domination. And alien analysts began documenting human doctrine with increasing fascination and concern, noting distributed fleet structures, adaptive command protocols, autonomous resupply networks, and predictive operational algorithms that allowed human forces to react to multiple threats simultaneously, often anticipating enemy moves before they could be executed. And as the Council scrambled to codify protocols for reintegration of humanity into formal structures, Harper and the leadership team maintained strict independence, ensuring that recognition by the Council did not constrain human operational freedom, because the lessons of the original band had instilled the principle that survival, efficiency, and strategic clarity outweighed ceremonial inclusion. And as negotiations progressed, humanity demonstrated not only military and logistical superiority, but also a capacity for diplomacy that balanced firmness with pragmatism, ensuring compliance and cooperation from former rebel factions without unnecessary loss of life. And in doing so, humans established themselves as the arbiters of stability in multiple sectors, a role that alien species had neither anticipated nor been prepared to accept. And as months passed, the Council formally reinstated humanity as a voting member. But the reality was symbolic rather than functional, because humans had already exercised decisive influence over the outcome of conflicts, the stabilization of trade and resource networks, and the long-term security of numerous systems. And the galaxy itself had begun to recalibrate its perception of power, recognizing that humanity had returned from exclusion, not humbled but enhanced, not weakened but more capable, and that the band, originally intended as a form of containment, had inadvertently created a species fully prepared to act independently, strategically, and with a level of operational competence unmatched by any Council member. And throughout this period, Harper and his leadership team maintained a consistent message to both human forces and alien observers. Humanity acted not out of vengeance or ambition alone, but out of necessity, foresight, and principle, because in a galaxy governed by unpredictability, survival, and the ability to enforce order, while preserving life were the ultimate measures of power. And by the time the Council formally acknowledged human authority, the entire galaxy had already observed, learned, and adapted to the fact that humanity was no longer to be underestimated, dismissed, or excluded, because they had returned not as a petitioner but as the ultimate power, shaping the trajectory of interstellar politics, trade, and security for cycles to come. As human authority continued to expand, the subtle, methodical consolidation of power became evident not only in military engagements, but in the political and economic spheres of the galaxy, because Harper and his leadership team recognized that dominance was as much about perception, influence, and systemic control as it was about fleet strength. And so human operations extended beyond reclaiming territory to integrating governance, commerce, and intelligence networks into a coherent framework that could function independently of Council oversight. And while the Council continued to debate procedural recognition, human fleets acted with unprecedented autonomy, securing critical hyperspace junctions, resource-rich systems, and communications hubs, often preemptively disrupting rebel or rogue operations before they could even be coordinated. And the efficiency and precision of these interventions created a psychological impact across the galaxy, because alien species accustomed to hierarchical and bureaucratic command structures struggled to comprehend the decentralized, predictive, and adaptive approach that humans employed. And within Council chambers, delegates debated the implications, realizing that the ban, originally intended as containment, had inadvertently allowed humanity to develop a form of operational independence and strategic foresight unparalleled among known civilizations. And as Harper convened his senior staff, including Admiral Laura Bennett, General Marcus Hayes, and Chief Scientist Elena Ortiz, they focus on not only maintaining control over reclaimed systems, but also anticipating potential threats, identifying vulnerable nodes, and establishing rapid response protocols, all designed to ensure that human influence remained decisive even in the absence of formal authority. And these efforts extended into logistics, communications, and intelligence, creating a network of redundancies that allowed fleets to operate independently, yet cohesively, across multiple sectors simultaneously. And as rebel factions attempted to regain momentum, they encountered a human approach that combined precision strikes, adaptive tactics, and psychological pressure, forcing them into mistakes, miscalculations, and eventual surrender, while human forces maintained minimal casualties and maximum strategic effect, earning grudging acknowledgement from both allies and former adversaries that the species they had dismissed was now an unassailable power. And as the stabilization of multiple systems progressed, alien analysts documented and disseminated accounts of human fleet composition, operational doctrine, and decision-making protocols, noting the unprecedented combination of autonomy, coordination, and predictive capability. And while the Council scrambled to codify integration protocols for humanity, Harper maintained strict operational independence, understanding that the lessons of the original ban demanded that humans preserve the freedom to act decisively without external interference. And as weeks turned into cycles, the galaxy began to recalibrate its perception of power, recognizing that humans had returned not merely as participants, but as arbiters capable of shaping political, economic, and military outcomes. And across multiple sectors, trade, communication, and defense networks were reorganized under human supervision, establishing stability while reinforcing perception of human dominance. And as the Council formally reinstated humanity as a voting member, the reality on the ground had already rendered symbolic recognition irrelevant, because humans had already defined a balance of power, and through a combination of strategic foresight, technological advancement, disciplined command, and operational excellence, they had demonstrated that exclusion had not weakened humanity, but transformed them into the ultimate power, capable of directing the trajectory of galactic civilization with clarity, precision, and ethical restraint. And everywhere from outer rim colonies to core trade hubs, the message was clear. Humanity had been banned, humanity had returned, and humanity now dictated the rules of engagement, governance, and survival across the stars. As humanity's influence solidified further, the galaxy began to perceive a transformation not only in power, but in the very nature of interstellar diplomacy, because Harper and his leadership team recognized that true dominance required more than military superiority. It required shaping alliances, trade networks, and the perception of inevitability. And so human operations expanded to include coordinated economic policies, strategic resource distribution, and technological sharing designed to stabilize systems under human protection while subtly reinforcing dependence on human oversight. And alien species, from Council loyalists to former rebel factions, began to adjust their policies, trade routes, and fleet deployments in response to the unseen hand of human planning, a hand that combined predictive intelligence, decentralized command, and rapid response, ensuring that every sector operated within parameters favorable to human strategic goals. And while the Council continued to deliberate over symbolic recognition, human fleets acted with precision and efficiency, preempting potential conflicts, neutralizing insurgent activities, and demonstrating an operational adaptability that alien species could neither predict nor effectively counter. And as Harper convened with Admiral Laura Bennett, General Marcus Hayes, Chief Scientist Elena Ortiz, and other senior leaders, they focused on long-term stability, embedding human oversight into local governance structures, training local forces in adaptive tactics, and deploying autonomous support networks capable of sustaining order without constant human supervision. And this strategy created a web of influence that extended across multiple systems, allowing humans to enforce security, maintain economic continuity, and preserve civil infrastructure while remaining unbound by Council constraints. And as rebel factions attempted sporadic resurgence, they were met not with reckless aggression, but with calculated responses that disrupted command cohesion, destroyed supply lines, and forced repeated retreats, demonstrating human mastery of both tactical and operational warfare. And reports of these operations spread quickly among alien analysts, who documented human doctrine, modular fleet structures, adaptive command protocols, and predictive logistics as unprecedented. And while the Council scrambled to reconcile human integration with traditional authority, Harper maintained independence, understanding that any dilution of operational freedom could compromise the hard-earned advantage humanity had cultivated since the ban. And as cycles passed, the galaxy began to recognize that human influence extended beyond immediate military engagements to shaping political outcomes, economic stability, and interstellar trade. Because human intervention was decisive, consistent, and strategically calibrated, and as council members formally reinstated humanity, it became evident that symbolic acceptance was secondary to the operational reality already established, and across sectors, the impact was undeniable. Alien fleets realigned, trade agreements were renegotiated, communication networks were recalibrated, and even previously hostile factions approached humans with measured respect, acknowledging that the species they had once dismissed now dictated the terms of engagement, governance, and survival, and through a combination of foresight, disciplined execution, technological advantage, and strategic patience, humans had transformed a period of exclusion into a proving ground, emerging not as petitioners seeking approval, but as the ultimate power, capable of shaping the galaxy with clarity, precision, and enduring authority. And the message echoed from core worlds to outer rim colonies. Humanity had been banned, humanity had returned, and humanity now defined the rules by which civilizations would endure and prosper across the stars. With humanity now fully recognized as the ultimate power in the galaxy, the culmination of decades of preparation, strategic foresight, and disciplined execution became visible not only in military dominance, but in the total reconfiguration of political, economic, and social structures across multiple sectors. Because Harper and his leadership council had understood from the beginning that exclusion was not punishment but opportunity, a chance to observe, learn, and evolve without interference. And so humans implemented an integrated framework that combined fleet deployment, automated defense networks, intelligence gathering, trade regulation, and diplomatic engagement into a cohesive system that ensured stability, projected influence, and allowed rapid adaptation to emerging threats and alien species, from council loyalists to former rebels, were forced to acknowledge that the humans they had dismissed were now the decisive factor in every major conflict, negotiation, and strategic decision. And while the council officially welcomed humanity back, the true authority rested with human operational control, because humans had already secured key junctions, stabilized trade corridors, reclaimed contested systems, and demonstrated the ability to enforce compliance without unnecessary destruction. And across the galaxy, intelligence networks, sensor arrays, and fleet movements were all coordinated under human oversight, creating a level of efficiency and foresight that alien commanders could neither predict nor counter. And as cycles passed, rebel factions were fully dismantled or incorporated into systems governed under human guidance, their previous threats neutralized not only by force, but by strategic containment, diplomacy, and the establishment of resilient infrastructure. And while some council delegates feared the erosion of traditional authority, it became evident that human intervention had restored order, secured commerce, and stabilized populations in a manner that bureaucracy alone could never have achieved. And through every engagement, whether military, economic, or political, humans demonstrated a unique combination of precision, adaptability, and ethical restraint, ensuring maximum effect with minimal loss, a doctrine that reshaped the standards of interstellar power. And as Harper oversaw the final phases of integration, he emphasized that humanity's rise was not vengeance, but consequence, the natural result of preparation, observation, and calculated action. And as outer rim colonies, core systems, and council worlds alike adjusted to the new order, the message became unmistakable. The species once banned, dismissed, and underestimated had returned not as supplicants or petitioners, but as the ultimate authority capable of shaping the trajectory of civilizations across the galaxy. And the galaxy itself had begun to acknowledge that human foresight, discipline, technological mastery, and strategic patience had created a force whose influence could not be ignored, manipulated, or countered without severe consequence. And as humans established permanent operational bases, autonomous fleet coordination networks, and adaptive governance systems, every decision, every engagement, and every negotiation reinforced a single truth: humanity had been banned, humanity had returned, and humanity now held unassailable power, defining the rules of engagement, governance, and survival for all species across the stars. And the galaxy would never again underestimate the species that had learned, grown, and returned stronger than any council, any coalition, or any adversary could have imagined. securing a new era where human initiative, competence, and authority dictated the future of interstellar civilization with absolute clarity, precision, and enduring control.